There were 400 people in that room. I know the exact number because I counted the chairs 3 times the week before the wedding, because that's the kind of thing I do. I'm the one who counts. I'm the one who confirms. I'm the one who shows up at the venue at 7 a.m. on a Saturday with a measuring tape and a printed seating chart and a backup copy of the seating chart, because I learned a long time ago that if I didn't do it, it simply would not get done. 400 people. And when Richard Holt leaned into that microphone and said what he said, every single one of them heard it. I was holding my champagne glass. I want you to picture that. I had it in both hands, the way you hold something when you're trying to look comfortable and you're not quite there yet. And I was smiling because my daughter was married, my daughter was happy, and I had told myself 3 months ago that this was the day I was finally going to let go of the vigilance. Just for one night, just for 6 hours, just set it down. The glass had a small chip on the rim. I had noticed it when they handed it to me. The way I notice everything, the way I have always noticed everything, and I told myself it didn't matter. A chipped champagne glass at your daughter's wedding. Let it go, Miriam. Let it go. I was still holding that glass when Richard Holt made his joke. That's what he called it afterward, a joke. Welcome back to The Last Verdict, where heartbreak turns into quiet strength. If you've ever been the one everyone leaned on but nobody truly saw, stay with me. This one is going to feel familiar. Because here's what I need you to understand before I tell you everything. I did not yell. I did not cry. I did not make a scene at my daughter's wedding. I waited. And the waiting, as you're about to see, was the most powerful thing I have ever done. My name is Miriam. I'm 54 years old. I work as a hospital administrator in a mid-sized city in the Midwest, the kind of job where you are functionally the person who makes sure nothing collapses, and where you are thanked for this approximately never, because systems that work correctly are invisible. I have been doing that job for 22 years. I have been doing a version of it, the invisible, load-bearing, keep it from collapsing version, for my entire life. I have one daughter. Her name is Claire. She is, without qualification, the best thing that has ever happened to me, and I say that knowing it sounds like something people say, and meaning it the way people mean it when it's actually true. Claire's father, her biological father Daniel, left when she was 2 years old. Not dramatically, not violently. He just slowly became someone who was somewhere else. Phone calls that got shorter, visits that got postponed, a birthday card that arrived for Claire's 4th birthday with a $20 bill and no return address, and then nothing. Just nothing, for years at a time, and then a phone call on a random Tuesday like he'd simply gone to the grocery store. I want to be clear about Daniel because this story requires it. He is not a villain. He is a man who was not built for the weight of being a father, who knew it on some level, and who chose the path of least resistance at every junction. I know where he learned that. His own father was the same. You can understand the architecture of a failure and still be the one who has to live in the wreckage. Daniel was not at the wedding. He was invited. Claire, who has a heart that is somehow larger than the circumstances that shaped it, invited him. He RSVP'd yes, and then, 2 weeks before, sent a text saying he had a conflict. No apology, no explanation, just something came up. Claire read that text, folded her phone face down on the kitchen counter and said, "Okay, moving on." That's my daughter. I raised her to move on. I'm not sure anymore whether that was wisdom or damage. My mother, Sandra, was there. Sandra, who has an explanation for everything, delivered warmly, hand on your arm, in a tone that makes you feel like you're the one being irrational. My best friend of 29 years, a woman named Pat, was there, in a dress that was slightly too festive for a guest and exactly right for Pat. My colleague James, who was the only person at work who knew how hard the previous year had been, was there with his husband Marco. These are the people I could find in that room when I needed to find someone. That specific geography of safety. And then there was the Holt family. Thomas Holt, my son-in-law, is a genuinely good man. I want that stated plainly. He loves Claire with a steadiness that I recognize and respect. Because steadiness is not glamorous, but it is the thing that actually matters, and I spent enough years without it to know the difference. Thomas is kind. Thomas is present. Thomas is, on his own, exactly the kind of person I hoped my daughter would find. His father, Richard, is something else. Richard Holt is the kind of man who has been the most important person in every room he has ever entered, and who has never once considered the possibility that this was not simply the natural order of things. He is handsome in an aging, deliberate way. He has opinions delivered as facts. He laughs loudly and often, and just a half second too long. He is the kind of man who calls waitresses sweetheart and doesn't notice the small freezing that happens in their shoulders when he does. I met him 3 times before the wedding. The first time he asked me what I did, I told him, and he said, "Ah, so the invisible hand that keeps the machine running," and moved on to talk to someone else. The second time, the rehearsal dinner, which his family hosted at a restaurant they chose without consulting me. I'm not saying they should have consulted me. I'm saying they did not consider it. The third time, he looked at me across the rehearsal dinner table and said, "Claire tells us you did this whole thing pretty much alone. Good for you." And he smiled. And I smiled back, and the first stored that moment the way I store moments. The way you learn to store moments when you've spent a lifetime understanding that things reveal themselves slowly, and patience is the only intelligence that matters. I was that woman, before the wedding, watching, waiting, still, possibly willing to be wrong. Let me tell you about the 3 months before the wedding, because the wedding was not where this started. When Claire and Thomas announced their engagement, I cried in my car for 15 minutes. I want to be honest about that. 15 minutes. Not from sadness, from something more complicated. A woman who has done everything alone, I mean everything, does not simply hand her daughter to another family without a moment of reckoning. You ask yourself, did I do it right? Did she learn the right things? Did I teach her to recognize what love looks like when I spent so many years without a model for it myself? Then I dried my face, drove home, and started a spreadsheet. That's who I am. That's what I do. When the emotion is too large, I make it smaller by giving it columns and rows. The wedding budget was initially discussed as a shared cost between both families. That was the understanding, not written, not formal, but spoken. Richard Holt at the engagement dinner had said, "We'll take care of everything, don't you worry." He said it the way men like Richard say things, expansively, with a wave of a hand, with the confidence of someone who has never had to follow up on a promise because someone else always has. Over the next 4 months, the Holt family's everything turned out to cover the venue, partially. Thomas's aunt had a discount connection, the rehearsal dinner, and the honeymoon. What I covered, the photographer, the florist, the catering overage when the Holt guest list expanded by 34 people 3 weeks before the event without a conversation. The dress alterations, the bridesmaid's emergency kit, and if you've never assembled a wedding emergency kit, it contains, among other things, fashion tape, 2 kinds of pain reliever, a sewing kit, stain remover, blister bandages, a portable phone charger, and a bottle of Pepto-Bismol, because I have been alive long enough to know that bodies have opinions about stress. The welcome bags for out-of-town guests, the card box, the unity candle, the tip envelopes. In total, I spent $23,400 on my daughter's wedding. I am not telling you this for sympathy. I am telling you this because at the reception, Richard Holt was going to stand at that microphone and tell 400 people a story about this wedding. And the version he told was not the version that happened. If you've ever watched someone take credit for a life you built, slowly, over years, with your bare hands, you already know what I'm describing. I need to tell you about the seating chart moment. This is where I should have known, where the pattern, which I had been charitable enough to call oversight, showed itself to be something more deliberate. 3 weeks before the wedding, I was at Claire and Thomas's apartment, working on final arrangements. The seating chart was spread on their kitchen table. Claire was in the shower. Thomas was at work. Richard Holt stopped by, unannounced, which was his style, and picked up the seating chart. He looked at it for a moment, then he said, "Miriam, we should move the Chandler table. Rich and Denise Chandler need to be up front. They came a long way." I explained that the front tables were reserved for immediate family. He said, "Right, but Rich and I go back 30 years. He's practically family." I said the arrangement was set. He looked at me, not angry, not unkind, just patient in the way that powerful people are patient when they've decided you're going to agree with them eventually, and he said, "We'll figure it out." He changed the seating chart. I found out 2 days later when the venue coordinator called me with a question about the new arrangement. The Chandler table had moved. A table I had carefully arranged, my mother, Pat, James, and Marco, had been shifted to a position near the kitchen. I called Claire. She apologized. She said Thomas would talk to his dad. Thomas talked to his dad. The table moved back. But here's the thing about that moment, and here's why I'm telling you about it. I noted it. I filed it. I did not say anything to Richard. I did not make it an issue. I simply picked up the chipped champagne glass of that situation, held it in both hands, and kept going. Some things you store. Some things you let accumulate. Because you know from 54 years of being a woman who sees everything, that the moment will come when the accumulated weight of all those stored things will be exactly what you need. Subscribe if you're here for the first time, because the moment is coming. And when it comes, I want you to have been with me from the beginning. The wedding was beautiful. I want to say that clearly and without irony. It was genuinely, specifically beautiful. The light through the venue windows at 4 o'clock was the exact color I had hoped it would be. Claire walked down the aisle in a dress we found together on our third try, at a bridal shop 40 minutes from home, and when I saw her in it I thought, this is what it was for. All of it. Everything. This is what it was for. Thomas cried when he saw her, not performatively, actually cried, the way people cry when they're too full to do anything else. I liked him more for it. The ceremony was 42 minutes long. The cocktail hour moved into dinner. Everything ran on schedule, because I had made a 14-page document for the vendors and the venue coordinator, and had sent the final version at 9 p.m. the night before, with a note that said, "If anything changes, call me first." I was at table 3, my mother Sandra on my left, Pat on my right, James and Marco across from me. We ate, we talked. I was starting to understand that I might actually be able to enjoy this. And then the toast began. Thomas's best man went first. Funny, warm, a story about Thomas and a broken-down car and a girl who wasn't Claire. Perfectly calibrated, landed well. Claire's maid of honor went next. She cried. Everyone cried. I cried. Pat held my hand. Then Richard Holt stood up. He was in a navy suit. He had been drinking, not excessively, just enough to expand into himself. He took the microphone with the ease of a man who has always had a microphone when he wanted one, and he smiled at the room, and the room smiled back. Because that is what rooms do with men like Richard. He talked about Thomas. Proud, genuine even. I found myself thinking, maybe I was wrong about him. Then he talked about Claire. He said she was extraordinary. He said she was the woman who had made his son better. He said that when Thomas brought her home for the first time, Richard knew, he just knew, that this was the one. And then he paused. And he said, "Now, Claire didn't have the easiest start in life. She grew up without a lot of advantages, but she rose above it. She really rose above it." The room made a small sound, not quite a murmur, more like the collective inhale of 400 people who weren't sure yet whether to be uncomfortable. I did not move, and I think, Richard continued, setting his glass down with the confidence of a man delivering a conclusion, that the Holt family is going to give her everything she's been missing. We're going to give her a real family. The kind of stability and support that, well, that she hasn't always had. He raised his glass. He said, "To Claire. Welcome home, sweetheart." And 400 people raised their glasses. Most of them didn't understand what had just happened. I could see it in their faces, polite smiles, a little confused, ready to move on. Pat understood. I could see it in the way she put her fork down very carefully. My mother Sandra put her hand on my arm and said nothing. Sandra, who has an explanation for everything, had nothing. And I held that chipped champagne glass, both hands. And I took one breath, and then another, and I did not raise it. 400 people, and in front of all of them, Richard Holt had just told the world that my daughter had been raised without stability, without support, without a real family, that she was essentially a charity case the Holts were generously absorbing. He had erased 22 years in 4 sentences. He had looked at my $23,400, my measuring tape, my 14-page vendor document, my emergency kit, my spreadsheets, my 15 minutes crying in the car, my entire life as a mother, and he had summarized it as, not a lot of advantages. Pause with me here, because I want you to understand what I did next. I want you to understand it completely. I set the glass down, carefully, not loudly, carefully. And I picked up my phone, and I texted 2 people. That was all. I did not stand up. I did not make a face. I smiled just slightly when my eyes met Thomas's across the room, and I saw the horror in his, the pure, helpless, "I am so sorry" horror, and I gave him the smallest nod that said, "Not tonight. I've got this." Because I did have it. I had been having it for 22 years. The 2 people I texted were Pat and my accountant. Pat's text said, "Are you okay?" I replied, "More than okay. I need you to witness something in about 72 hours. My accountant's text, his name is Gary, and Gary has been doing my taxes for 11 years and knows my finances better than I know them myself, said simply, "Hey Gary, I need to pull some documentation together this week. The full picture. Can you have it ready by Tuesday?" Gary, who is efficient and has learned not to ask me unnecessary questions, replied, "Sure. What am I documenting?" I typed, "Everything." Here's what I want you to understand about the 48 hours after the wedding. I did not spiral. I did not call my friends and cry. I did not replay the speech obsessively. I have been doing this, managing, adjusting, absorbing, planning, for 22 years. I have sat across from hospital board members who dismissed me. I have navigated systems designed to make people like me invisible. I have done it calmly, procedurally, with documentation. I was not going to fall apart over a wedding toast. What I did was organize. I pulled every receipt from the wedding, every invoice, the florist, the photographer, the catering overage. I had specifically the email from the Holt family's wedding coordinator confirming the guest list expansion, and a follow-up email 2 days later noting that the bride's mother has graciously agreed to cover the additional catering cost. Graciously. That word. I had the seating chart incident documented, not formally, but I had the email chain with the venue coordinator time-stamped, showing the unauthorized change and subsequent correction. I had 3 months of text messages, including one from Richard Holt that said, "Don't worry about the flowers, Miriam, we've got it," and a follow-up receipt showing that I had in fact paid for the flowers because "we've got it" had turned out to mean "we've got the conversation about it." 41 documents. A total expenditure of $23,400 from my personal accounts. 3 months of correspondence in which I had functioned, to use a word I do not use lightly, as the invisible infrastructure of an event that another man had just publicly claimed credit for providing. And then I called Claire. This is the part that people ask me about most. They want to know, were you angry at her? Did you blame her? No, not for a second. Claire called me before I called her. She called me the morning after the wedding, before they left for the honeymoon, and she was crying in the way she almost never cries, in the full, helpless way of a person who is genuinely ashamed of something they did not do. She said, "Mom, I'm so sorry. I didn't know he was going to say that. If I had known." I said, "I know." She said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, and I meant it completely, "I'm going to let you go on your honeymoon, and when you come back, I'm going to have a conversation with your father-in-law, and you don't need to be there for it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He's not a bad person, Mom." I said, "I know that too." She said, "Are you sure you're okay?" And I said, "Claire, in your entire life, have I ever told you I was okay when I wasn't?" She laughed, that particular laugh she has, the one that's half relief, and said, "No, you've never done that." Then I'm okay. If you're watching this and you've ever been told you were overreacting when you had the receipts, literally and figuratively, drop a comment, because what I found when I finished organizing was not just 41 documents. It was a pattern, a shape, the architecture of exactly what had been done and how, and more importantly, what I was going to do about it. Subscribe if you haven't. We're almost at the part that changed everything. I asked Richard Holt to meet me for coffee. Not at their house. Not at a restaurant where he would feel at home. I chose a cafe near my office. Neutral, public, quiet enough for a real conversation. I made the reservation for a Tuesday, 11 days after the wedding. Claire and Thomas were back from their honeymoon. I had spoken to Thomas briefly, not in detail, just enough to let him know that this was something I needed to do, and that I was not looking to damage his relationship with his father or his marriage. Thomas said, "I know what he said was wrong. I've told him that." I said, "I appreciate that, but I'd like to speak to him myself." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He won't apologize. I just want you to know that going in. He doesn't think he did anything wrong. He thinks he was paying Claire a compliment." I said, "I know." I arrived at the cafe 7 minutes early, which is what I do. I had a folder. In the folder were 7 documents. Not all 41, just the 7 most specific, most clearly illustrative ones. I had chosen them the way you choose evidence, not to overwhelm, but to demonstrate. A nurse friend of mine once told me that when a patient is in denial about a diagnosis, you don't show them everything at once. You show them the one image that cannot be argued with. Then you wait. Richard arrived 4 minutes late, which is also what he does. He was warm initially, ordered coffee, asked about my job, made a small joke about the wedding and how fast it all went. And then he looked at me across the table and said, in the tone of a man who has already decided what this meeting is, "Miriam, I hope you're not here to make this into something." I said, "I'm not here to make it into anything. It already is something." He settled back in his chair. The settling back in the chair is its own kind of statement. I have seen it in board meetings, the physical performance of not being threatened. I said, "At the reception, you told 400 people that Claire grew up without advantages, without stability, without a real family." and that your family was going to provide those things for her. He said, "That's not what I said." I opened the folder. I had, because I am me, a transcription. A guest at the wedding, a young woman who worked in Claire's office and had been recording video during the toasts for their shared team group chat, had sent me the video 3 days after. I had the transcript. I put it on the table. He looked at it. He said, "I was talking about Daniel." I said, "You didn't mention Daniel." He said, "Everyone knew I meant Daniel." I said, "You said not a lot of advantages. You said the kind of stability and support she hasn't always had. You said your family was going to give her a real family." I paused. "You said that in front of the people who watched me raise her." He shifted. He said, "Miriam, I think you're being very sensitive about what was meant as a tribute to Claire." There it is. If you've ever told the truth about how something landed and been told it's your sensitivity that's the problem, you know this exact moment. This is the moment. I put the second document on the table, the catering overage email, the one that said, "The bride's mother has graciously agreed." I said, "This is the catering overage from your family's expanded guest list. I paid it. $4,200. He looked at it. He said, "We had a lot of people who wanted to celebrate Thomas." I said, "I know, I paid for them." I put down the third document, the florist invoice. I said, "You told me not to worry about the flowers." He said, "I thought Patricia was handling that." I said, "Patricia didn't. I did." 3 weeks before the wedding, when the vendor called to confirm payment. Minimize. Deflect. Then, after a pause, "Look, these things get complicated in weddings. Nobody's keeping score." I said, "I'm keeping score." And then I put all 7 documents on the table. I said, "In total, I spent $23,400 on my daughter's wedding. I did it without being asked to and without complaint and without expecting anything from you, because Claire's wedding was not a transaction, it was an act of love. I want to be clear that I do not regret $1 of it." He was quiet. This was new. Men like Richard are not often quiet. I said, "But you stood at a microphone and told 400 people, including my mother, my best friend, and my colleagues, that my daughter had been raised without advantages, without support, without a real family. And you told them that your family was going to correct that." I said, "So I need you to understand very clearly what you erased when you said that, and I need you to understand what happens next." He said, "And what does happen next?" I said, "I'm going to tell you exactly." I closed the folder. I said, "The accounts are what I say they are. The history is what I say it is. Going forward, when the story of Claire's family is told, at holidays, at dinners, in front of future grandchildren, I will be in it accurately, or I will not be in the room. That is not a threat. It is a policy. I have been the invisible infrastructure of too many rooms for too long to be made invisible at the one event that was supposed to be mine to witness." He said, "I don't think you understand how this looks." I said, "I understand exactly how this looks." And then I said, "And I want this exact sentence noted. You called her a charity case in a navy suit at my daughter's wedding while I was holding a glass I paid for. He had nothing. Not because he was ashamed, not yet, but because in 41 years of being the most important person in every room, he had never had someone put a folder on the table. I picked up my coffee cup. I drank the rest of it. I said, "Thank you for meeting me." I stood up. I put the folder under my arm, and I left. The narrative machine started within 48 hours. I know this because Sandra told me. Sandra, who has an explanation for everything, was, in this instance, my most useful intelligence source, because people tell Sandra things because she seems like someone who will understand. And she does understand. She just also tells me. The story, in the Holt family version, Miriam was upset about the toast because she's always been sensitive about the Daniel situation. Miriam took it the wrong way. Miriam has some issues around money that stem from the divorce. Richard meant well. Richard loves Claire. This has been blown out of proportion by a woman who, understandably, is having a hard time letting go. Two of Thomas's aunts called Claire to offer their sympathies to her for having a difficult mother-in-law situation. One person in my own circle, a woman I had considered a peripheral friend, told Pat that she'd heard both sides and, "It sounds complicated." I noted her name. I revised her position in my geography of safety. Thomas's younger brother Marcus called me this, surprised me. Marcus is 27. I had met him 4 times, he said, Mrs. Miriam. I just wanted to say, I was there. I heard what my dad said. I don't think it was okay. He paused. Then, I told him that. He didn't take it well. I thanked him. I meant it. And Pat. Pat, who had seen it happen and said nothing in the moment because she was watching me to determine what I needed, called me the night after the cafe meeting and said, "How do you feel?" I said, "I feel like someone who set something down." She said, "Was it heavy?" I said, 22 years heavy." She said, "Good." The first morning after the cafe, a Wednesday ordinary work at 8:30, I woke up at 6:07 and made coffee and sat at my kitchen table, and I noticed something, the particular quality of the quiet. Not the quiet of absence. I am used to that kind of quiet. I have been alone in this apartment for 11 years. But the quiet of a thing resolved, a file closed, a debt paid, the quiet of a room where an argument has finished and the air has stopped holding it. I had not felt that kind of quiet in a long time. I didn't try to name it, I just sat in it. I'm going to tell you what this cost, because if I don't, you will think it was clean, and it was not clean, it was not free. In the 3 months after the cafe meeting, family gatherings became something that required negotiation, not hostile negotiation, managed negotiation. Thanksgiving at Claire and Thomas's, I attended the afternoon portion, left before Richard arrived for the evening. Christmas, I initiated my own Christmas morning tradition with Claire, just the 2 of us, for the first time, before she went to the Holts. We ate eggs and drank coffee and watched a movie and did not discuss anything heavy. It was, genuinely, the best Christmas morning I have had in years. But I had to build it because the old version had been made unavailable. There were evenings, more than I'll admit here, where I sat with the specific grief of knowing I had done everything correctly and still paid a price. That's the part they don't show you in resolution stories. The part where you've been right and it doesn't feel like winning. Where you've set something down and your hands still know the shape of it. You can grieve people who are still alive. It is the most common grief there is. I grieve the version of this story where Richard Holt was simply a man I misread, where the toast was genuinely clumsy and he would, given the chance, have recognized it. I don't fully believe that version anymore, but I grieve it anyway, the way you grieve a door that was never actually open, knowing, even as you mourn it, that you're mourning something that didn't exist. What I did not lose my daughter. My daughter called me every week. She came to my apartment for dinner twice a month. She told me 6 weeks after the cafe meeting, Thomas talked to his dad, like really talked to him. I don't know what will come of it, but he did. I said, that's Thomas's work to do. I'm glad he's doing it. And that, strangely, unexpectedly, was the small thing that told me everything had shifted. Not that Richard had been confronted, not that I'd been vindicated, but that my daughter knew the difference between my work and her husband's work, and understood them both as valid, and was navigating the space between them with more grace than I would have managed at her age. She learned that from somewhere. 6 weeks after the cafe meeting, Richard Holt sent me an email. It was not an apology. I want to be very precise about that. It was a 3-paragraph email in which he explained that he had reflected on our conversation and acknowledged that the toast could have been worded differently. He said he hoped we could move forward in a positive way for Claire and Thomas's sake. That was it. Reflection, wording, moving forward. I read it twice, then I forwarded it to Gary. Gary had, in fact, compiled the full financial documentation I'd asked for. Itemized, clean, precise. I had used it in the cafe meeting. But Gary had also, on his own initiative, calculated something I hadn't asked for, based on what I had spent. The venue subsidy the Holts received through their family connection and the rehearsal dinner costs. He wanted me to see the actual split. The Holt's contribution, accounting for the family discount, was $17,800. Mine was $23,400. On a wedding that Richard Holt had publicly described as a Holt family gift to a girl who grew up without advantages, I looked at Gary's calculation for a long time. Then I emailed Richard back. One sentence. Thank you for your reflection. I look forward to Claire and Thomas's future. That was all. I did not enumerate. I did not send the documents. I did not correct the record in writing because the record had been corrected already in a cafe at a table with a folder on a Tuesday. He knew what I knew. That was enough. What happened in the 4 months after that was something I had not predicted. The story changed. Not dramatically, not with a retraction, not with an announcement, but the Holt family, in small and specific ways, began acknowledging what I had done. Richard's wife Linda, who had said nothing at the wedding and nothing after, called me in February. She said, I should have said something at the time. I didn't. I'm saying it now. She said my name 3 times in that call, not Claire's mom, not Miriam, but just Miriam plainly, as if I had been there all along. She did not make it bigger than it was. I respected that. Here is where we are now. 11 months after the wedding, my daughter is happy. Her marriage is good. Thomas is the kind of husband I hoped she would find, still, present, steady. They are talking quietly about the future. Richard Holt and I have not become close. We have become cordial, a specific, managed cordiality that both of us understand. He does not wave his hand expansively when he talks about the wedding. He does not take credit for things I did. Whether that is genuine recalibration or strategic silence, I cannot say. I have decided it does not matter. What matters is the room is different now. The chipped champagne glass. I looked for it after the reception. I don't know what happened to it. Venue glasses go into a collective bin. You can't trace them back. But I think about it sometimes. That small imperfection I decided not to mention, the way I held it in both hands and decided, for one evening, to let things be imperfect. And I think, that was the last time I'll do that. Not because I'm angry, not because I've become the kind of person who needs everything to be acknowledged, but because I am 54 years old. I have spent my entire adult life being the invisible infrastructure. I have been the one who counts the chairs and assembles the emergency kit, and makes the 14-page document, and pays the overage and holds the glass, and stays quiet when the microphone is passed to someone else. I am not doing it quietly anymore. Not for nothing. not without being seen. My name is in the story now. I put it there myself. And if you are reading this thinking about your own folder, your own receipts, your own 22 years of evidence that you have been building without knowing you were building it, here is what I want you to know. The folder is not for revenge. The folder is for clarity. Bring it to the table, put it down, let them see the shape of what was done, and then drink your coffee and leave. The truth does not need you to stay in the room once you've delivered it. If you are the strong one in your family, if you are the one who counts the chairs and absorbs the overages and holds the glass and keeps smiling when the microphone belongs to someone else, hear this. Being reliable is not the same as being invisible. Performing the work is not consent to be erased from it. At some point, the strength you have been giving away becomes strength you can decide to keep. I am not the woman who apologized for taking up space. I am the woman who put a folder on the table and drank her coffee and left. I am the woman who paid $23,400 and spent 22 years and raised a daughter who knows the difference between what she was given and what was withheld, and who was loved, genuinely loved, with advantages too many to count. That is the record. That is what happened. If this story felt familiar, if you heard yourself in any part of it, share it. Share it with your friend, share it with your sister, share it with the woman in your life who has been the invisible infrastructure long enough. And if you have your own folder, start building it. The chipped glass was never the problem. The problem was staying quiet about the chip. That's the story. I'll see you in the next one.